On Monday, April the 4th, 1977, Southern Airways Flight 242 departed Huntsville, Alabama on a routine flight headed to Atlanta, Georgia. The Douglas DC-9 flight was piloted by Captain William McKenzie and First Officer Lyman Keel, Jr. Before departing Huntsville, Captain McKenzie and the First Officer had been provided a weather report. It indicated possible storms in their path. However, the report had aged by the time Flight 242 took to the southern skies. The DC-9 was carrying 85 people, including the flight crew, that day. All was going smoothly until Southern 242 encountered a severe thunderstorm near Rome, Georgia. Captain McKenzie and First Officer Keel attempted to navigate through the storm. They were engaging the Douglas DC-9's onboard radar system to look for a clear path through the weather. From all indications, the captain and first officer believed that they had located a clear path through the violent storm. But unfortunately, this was not the case. Subsequent reports indicate that the storm was so severe that it threw confusing signals to the radar, and the radar produced imagery that looked like a clear path. However, instead of flying a clear path avoiding the massive storm, Flight 242 flew directly into one of the most severe parts of it. As the aircraft penetrated the storm, extreme amounts of rainwater and large hail, reported to be the size of baseballs, were ingested into both engines, causing the initial failure of one engine. Captain McKenzie communicated to air traffic control to inform that one engine had been lost.
Just got our windshield busted, and we'll try to get it back up to 15. We're at 14. Another 242, you say you're at 14 now? So, couldn't help it. No left engine just cut out. Did you say you lost an engine and busted the windshield? Yes, sir.
It wasn't very long before the captain and first officer would soon discover they had not lost only one engine, but both engines.
But the other engine going who? Another 242 seconds. Right now, we lost both engines.
Violent weather had been raging throughout the southeast that day, with 21 confirmed tornado touchdowns in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The strongest of these was a catastrophic F5 tornado that occurred in northern Birmingham. These storms were responsible for 24 deaths and more than 200 injuries on the ground. Needless to say, many challenges lay ahead for the crew and passengers of Flight 242. At this point, the DC-9 was now gliding at approximately 14,000 feet through the violent weather, and Captain McKenzie began requesting information from air traffic control on potential airport options nearby. As the events were unfolding, radio communications with air traffic control were lost on multiple occasions, at times as much as 2 minutes. During the radio downtime, the pilots maneuvered the aircraft about frantically, looking for options for an emergency landing. However, these maneuvers would prove to be a critical factor later on, as these maneuvers took the aircraft into different directions and away from nearby runway landing opportunities. Once radio communications had been restored, air traffic control suggested Dobbins Air Force Base in Marietta, Georgia, as a potential runway landing opportunity. However, this option proved to be too late in coming, as Dobbins was now out of range due to the earlier flight maneuvers that occurred during the radio communications outage. Another unfortunate occurrence for the crew and passengers of Flight 242 was that there was an alternate airport in close proximity to their position, Cornelius Moore Airport in Cedartown, Georgia. But neither air traffic control nor the pilots had knowledge of this airport, as it was not listed on their aeronautical maps. At this point, options had run out.
We're putting it on the highway. We're down to nothing.
Captain McKenzie and First Officer Keel had no choice but to look for a clearing or roadway to attempt an emergency landing. From above, they chose a straight section of roadway that they could see, Georgia State Route 381 in New Hope, Georgia. As the captain and first officer were making every effort to maneuver the aircraft down and towards the roadway, time ran out. They descended below the tree line, and the aircraft began clipping the tops of the Georgia pines. Soon, the fuselage slammed into the earth and began skidding uncontrollably, plowing over everything in its path, eventually crashing into vehicles, gas pumps, and more trees. The DC-9 aircraft began breaking apart, and sections burst into flames, with pieces coming to rest along a disastrous and destructive path. Much of the debris and fuselage landed in the front yard of a neighborhood home, where the residents had heard the incredible crash, and they began coming out to offer assistance to those still living. The tail section was over here, the cockpit was over there, mangled jetliner parts, wires, cables, damaged and sheared off trees, broken limbs, torn up earth, dirt thrown about, luggage strewn all over, the wounded calling for help, and the bodies of those that had not survived. The scene was horrific. Much has been told about the passengers and crew of Southern Airways Flight 242 through the years, but what of those unfortunate souls who had tragically and unexpectedly lost their lives on the ground? Those who had no idea of the silent fate descending from above, the fate that awaited them on that dreadful April day. Richard Carter said goodbye to his wife Kathy and their 5-month-old son Jeffrey earlier that day. Kathy and Jeffrey had been joined by 5 other members of the family, and they were headed into town for some shopping that afternoon. Unbeknownst to them all, in the skies above, Flight 242 was in severe distress, quietly and eerily descending without engines, no thrust, out of options, and losing altitude at an alarming rate. Tragically, as fate would have it, Kathy and her family were parked at a convenience store on Georgia State Route 381 in New Hope, Georgia. The road that Captain McKenzie and First Officer Keel had chosen to attempt their emergency landing, the road that fate would pay an ominous visit to on that terrible April day. It came to pass as Southern Airways Flight 242, sliding by uncontrollably, clipped the gas pumps next to the vehicle, carrying Kathy and her family, sparking a rage of flames that engulfed the vehicle, killing them all. They had no chance. Of the 85 on board Southern Airways Flight 242, 62 were killed, 22 were seriously injured, and 1 was slightly injured. All in all, the bell tolled for 72 souls that day. On April the 4th, 1977, at 33 degrees, 57 minutes, 45 seconds north, and 84 degrees, 47 minutes, 13 seconds west, this was, and still remains, the location of the worst air disaster in Georgia history.